Is the world billions of years old? Are we the capstone of an evolutionary process that took eons, or did God just create us thousands of years ago? A relatively new scientific theory points to the latter, and if true, it not only confirms the young Earth creation model, but also has a dire warning for the future of mankind. If the recent pandemic taught us anything, it's that our demise is closer than we think. Viruses and threats are all around us, but could we have an even greater threat lurking within us? A threat so pervasive within our bodies that it's inescapable, no matter how far technology takes us. I'm talking about the threat of our own genetic material, the building blocks of human growth and development. Our genes control many features, such as hair and eye color, but they also affect the way the immune system works or how it responds to threats. And now scientists are finding that more and more people around the world are suffering because their immune systems are malfunctioning and are either unable to fight off infections or they're actually attacking the body's cells or organs, as it would attack an infection. This is what happens in autoimmune disorders such as lupus and rheumatoid arthritis. According to researchers with London's Francis Crick Institute, a leading global biomedical research center, the numbers of autoimmune cases began to increase about 40 years ago in the West. However, they conclude that we are now seeing some emerge in countries that have never had such diseases before. In America, about 30 to 40 million people are affected, while globally there are about 300 million people living with autoimmune disease, a rate increase of about 300 to 500% in the last few decades alone. While many blame it on diet alone, a world research expert working on this very problem, Carola Vanessa, states, "If you don't have a certain genetic susceptibility, you won't necessarily get an autoimmune disease, no matter how many Big Macs you eat." So what's causing our immune systems to fail us? Well, it turns out it may be just a symptom of a deeper problem. According to Dr. John Sanford, a renowned American geneticist from Cornell University, humanity is experiencing what all of the natural world is experiencing: entropy, or when energy goes from an ordered state to disorder. He proposes that humans are experiencing what he calls genetic entropy, or the eroding of the genomes of all living organisms because mutations are inherited from one generation to the next. It is, in fact, driving humanity and all other higher organisms to the point of extinction as mutations build up in populations over time. Think about how rust slowly spreads throughout a car over time. Each little bit of rust, which would be akin to a single mutation in an organism, is practically inconsequential on its own. But if the rusting process isn't stopped, it'll eventually destroy the structural integrity of the car. Similarly, imagine a copy of an Encyclopedia Britannica on a computer that has a virus that randomly swaps, switches, deletes, and inverts letters over time. Over time, the text would contain more and more errors until it became meaningless. In biological terms, mutational meltdown would have occurred. As we observe this genetic entropy in humans, we would begin to see things like visible birth defects, increased rates of autism, allergies, and autoimmune diseases, as I mentioned before. And now, new research in medical science identifies at least 2,600 diseases caused by genetic mutations, not to mention a decline in male sperm count worldwide, a sharp increase in dementia and Alzheimer's cases, and a disturbing rise in age-related ailments. But how does this relate to the Bible and creation? Dr. Sanford argues that humans could not possibly have been around for tens of thousands of years, let alone millions or billions if we consider our supposed evolutionary animal ancestors, because at the current rate of mutation and the number of generations that would have occurred, we would already be extinct. According to the data, Dr. Sanford concludes that the human species could only be several thousand years old, which comports with the biblical narrative. The Bible tells us that sin entered the world when Adam and Eve disobeyed God. Therefore, the whole of creation was subjected to a curse. And under that curse, all creation groans. The ground was cursed for Adam's sin. Thorns and thistles and noxious weeds began to grow. All of Eve's daughters have labored painfully in childbirth, and death entered the world. As a result, humans have been declining or degrading, not evolving, throughout the generations. And now there is scientific evidence that can prove it. This, however, flies in the face of everything that modern science has been teaching us about evolution. So let's back up a bit to correct some information about evolution. Dr. Sanford asks us to imagine believing that a single cell could randomly evolve into the incredible complexity of a human being through chance errors in DNA. It's like thinking a little red wagon could transform into a bicycle, then a motorcycle, an automobile, an airplane, and finally a space shuttle, all due to manufacturing mistakes. It wouldn't make a lot of sense, would it? You see, Charles Darwin's book on the origin of species introduced the concept of natural selection, but he didn't have the knowledge of genetics that we do today. Darwin believed that environmental or behavioral changes could alter genes passed on to the next generation. But that's not the case. Mutations, those typos in our DNA, play a significant role in genetic entropy. Just like mistakes in a computer code, mistakes in our genetic code destroy information. But here's the catch: most mutations are harmful. Estimates vary, but a common figure is that each child is born with around 100 new mutations. These are added to the ones that are already accumulated in previous generations. One estimate is that damaging mutations outnumber helpful ones by 1,000,000 to 1, and even most of the beneficial mutations turn out to break things, rather than actually make things. Rather, evidence shows that the mutations corrupt and destroy genetic information, and they especially cannot explain the arrival of new beneficial information or the emergence of new life forms. Natural selection does occur, but there's a misconception surrounding its role in creating new genetic information. It can only eliminate the unfit, not produce the fit. Selective breeding in dogs is a classic example of natural selection, but it doesn't add anything new. It eliminates certain genes but doesn't create new ones. All dog breeds belong to the same kind and can interbreed. Natural selection can produce variations within a kind, but cannot create entirely new kinds. Those who seek to debunk this theory point to antibiotic resistance in bacteria, which is often cited as evidence for evolution. But there's more to the story. According to Harvard biologist Stephen Palumbi, author of The Evolution Explosion, antibiotic resistance in bacteria existed even before the invention of antibiotics. Bacteria with resistance was already present, and antibiotics eliminated the non-resistant ones. Plasmid transfer and pre-existing genes explain antibiotic resistance without the need for new information. Evolutionists who deny genetic entropy try to argue that natural selection will remove the harmful mutations once they become significant, but this fails to understand the problem. Natural selection can only weed out individual mutations as they happen. Once mutations have accumulated enough to be a real, noticeable problem, they are then a problem in the entire population, not just an individual here or there. The whole population cannot be selected away, except by going extinct. What's really interesting is how the genealogies in Genesis suddenly start making a lot more sense once you realize that genetic entropy is a reality. Jacob, one of the patriarchs mentioned in Genesis, explicitly talks about how people used to live much longer in the past. He told Pharaoh in Genesis chapter 47, verse 9, "I have traveled this earth for 130 hard years, but my life has been short compared to the lives of my ancestors." In the early days, those ancient patriarchs from Adam to Moses were incredibly long-lived, and we can find records of their ages in several books of the Bible like Genesis, Exodus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, and Joshua. It's truly fascinating to see that all of these early patriarchs lived to be very old. And it might surprise you, but we can actually treat these ages as real data and analyze them, even though we don't really look at the Bible as a scientific source. Dr. Sanford and his team analyzed this data, taking the first generations from Adam to Noah and plotting their ages, finding that most of them lived to be over 900 years old. The lifespans were pretty consistent during that time, with only Enoch being the exception. Enoch didn't die but was taken up to heaven when he was pretty young compared to the other patriarchs. He was about 365 years old. Now, in modern times, it's hard for many people to believe that anyone could live that long. So, some Christians tend to dismiss these records as mere mythology. But here's the thing, the next part of the data is harder to brush off. Dr. Sanford looked at the lifespans of Noah and his descendants, and he noticed something significant. There's a sudden change in lifespans during Noah's time, followed by a consistent decline with each generation living shorter and shorter lives. This decline starts right around the time of the biblical flood. Dr. Sanford and his team want us to look at the statistical analysis of this plot, and he says it confirms the authenticity of the biblical data. Despite being sourced from different books written by different authors many years apart, the data remains coherent and internally consistent, which is highly unlikely to occur by chance. According to Dr. Sanford, anyone who has studied biological data can see how very, quote, tight the data is, meaning that the data points diverge very little from the trend line. The shape of the trend line, the smooth curve, explains 96% of the variation in the lifespan data. Another way to say this is that the lifespans are declining in a very mathematically precise manner. There are two possible explanations for this phenomenon. The first suggests that all of these data points, scattered throughout various Old Testament books, or fabricated by a cunning author with expertise in mathematics. This author would have aimed to deceive the world into believing in a dramatic and specific exponential decline in human fitness since the time of Noah. However, it does seem a bit irrational to believe that a mathematician would go to such lengths to fabricate numerous parts of the Old Testament solely to perpetuate this particular pattern of degeneration. Or the second explanation might be more reasonable, that the declining lifespans recorded in the Bible are genuine and accurately depict an historical degenerative process. His team states that it's illogical to dismiss the idea that all the relevant biblical accounts faithfully recorded true historical events and ages at death. The Old Testament reads like an unpretentious historical narrative, as if the authors were simply documenting history, and the long lives of the early patriarchs would have been widely recognized, obviously leading to systematic recording. Therefore, the challenge lies not with the Bible, but with our own disbelief. Dr. Sanford states that any biologist can readily recognize the shape of the downward slope as a biological decay curve, indicating a rapid degenerative process among Noah's descendants. And as I've shown earlier, recent scientific evidence strongly suggests that humans have been genetically degenerating for thousands of years due to accumulating mutations, known as genetic entropy. Further, biologically realistic numerical simulations support the conclusion that given our current mutation rate of approximately 100 new mutations per person per generation, human fitness and longevity historically followed a decay curve similar to the decline in life expectancies recorded in the Bible. Now, if we look back at the steep decline in lifespans just after the flood, it should be noted that the curve exceeded the predictions of the numerical simulations conducted by Dr. Sanford and team. This led them to consider that the flood might have been a high radiation event, potentially causing substantially higher mutation rates in the immediate centuries following it. Now, we can see that the lifespan data supports the historical and factual nature of the Bible, specifically the book of Genesis, and how a basic reading of the text seems to tell us that the earth and humanity are not millions or billions of years old. Moreover, the biblical data strongly aligns with the growing scientific evidence of genetic degeneration in humans, confirming the reality of genetic entropy and contradicting the concept of evolution, therefore serving as a powerful testament to the occurrence of the biblical fall. These discoveries show our urgent need for redemption, which can only be found in Jesus Christ, who entered the world to save us from the damaging effects of our sin by sacrificing himself on the cross, paying the price for our actions, and reuniting us with the Father. Paul writes in Romans chapter 18, verses 19 through 21, "For the creation waits with eager longing for the revealing of the sons of God. For the creation was subjected to futility, not willingly, but because of him who subjected it, in hope that the creation itself will be set free from its bondage to corruption and obtain the freedom of the glory of the children of God." Take care and God bless.